A good crowd this morning. Glad you're here. Just before class, we put out a new sheet for the next lesson, and that'll be for next week, and that begins the very first plague. So either after class or you can do it now, grab a copy of that and do some studying on that before we get to it. The first plague is water to blood, and we're going to talk about all the ramifications of that, what that must have looked like and been like and what they experienced in Egypt. But right now we're laying groundwork. We've got just one more lesson to finish up in our sort of fundamental groundwork type of lessons. And today we're talking about God versus the gods of Egypt, and that is lesson number 5. There are some extra copies of lesson number 5 we handed out last week on the back table if you want a copy of that. All right, so we like to open it up, obviously, for discussion. That's why we hand the notes out early, give everybody a chance to go through and study a little bit. And it's unusual, a little bit's unusual today, because we'll be talking about a lot of the culture of Egypt, specifically their religious culture, and that's mostly under question number 2 when we talk about some of the deities that existed in their lore, in their culture. All right, so here's the first question, and we'll spend a few minutes on this with a little bit of information on that too. All right, so number 1, read through the following verses: Exodus 12:12, Exodus 15:11, Exodus 18 verses 10 and 11. And what conclusion or conclusions can we draw from these verses? What do they tell us about the confrontation in Egypt between God and Pharaoh? Did anybody have a chance to go through and look at some of these verses? Now, we're going to read them in just a moment, but anybody get a chance to go through, and what did you get from this? Joel?
God is all powerful, and there's no competition, and he's recognized both by himself.
Yeah.
Blessed is the Lord, Moses' father-in-law, who recognized him all for goodness. He is God, he is the truth.
Yeah. Anybody else get anything from these verses? All right, let's take a look at them and let's see. I think Joel's exactly right. Let's go to Exodus chapter 12. Let's turn our Bibles to Exodus chapter 12. Exodus chapter 12. All right, look with me at verse 12, and let's see what we get out of verse 12. For I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and will strike all the firstborn of the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I'm the Lord. What stands out to you in the context of our discussion this morning from that verse?
God is going to demonstrate he's greater than all the gods.
He's demonstrating he's greater than the gods of Egypt. Art, saw your hand. Same thing? Okay, so he very plainly says that he's executing judgment on the gods of Egypt. Now, quick question. Were those gods real? No, they're not real. So how can he execute judgment on the gods of Egypt? What does that mean? Who was the benefit for? For the people. He was demonstrating to the people that their gods weren't real. He's actually been doing it since the beginning, as we'll see in just a moment. But it is a clear confrontation between two theologies, right? You've got God and the worldview that attends to God, and then the Egyptian culture and their worldview, and you have these two things in competition. And from the beginning, God has been demonstrating that he's the only God that exists. And if you can go back and remember last week, remember when Moses said to Pharaoh, my God, the Lord, said to let the people go. And what was his first statement? Who's the Lord? I don't know your God. I don't recognize your God. We had a big discussion about that last week. God has been demonstrating from the very beginning that I am the only God that exists. All right, so let's go to chapter 15. Exodus chapter 15. Exodus chapter 15. Now, if you look at the chapter and you can kind of grab that title at the beginning of the chapter, this is the song they are singing after the Egyptian army has been demolished, right? This is the song after the parting of the Red Sea. They've crossed over and now they're singing celebration songs because they've been delivered. Look at verse 11. Who is like you, O Lord, among the gods? Who is like you, glorious in holiness, fearful in praises, doing wonders. So even they knew after the fact that this was all one huge controversy, a competition between God and what he demonstrated about himself versus the gods of Egypt. They knew that after the fact. So there's a reference again to the gods in verse 11. Go to chapter 18. Exodus chapter 18. Let's all turn to Exodus chapter 18. Verse 10, please. And Jethro said, quiz, who's Jethro? His father-in-law. Remember, he was the priest of Midian. We saw that about 2 weeks ago. Jethro said, Blessed be the Lord who has delivered you out of the hand of the Egyptians and out of the hand of Pharaoh, and who has delivered the people from under the hand of the Egyptians. Now I know that the Lord is greater than who? Than all the gods. That's what it was all about. For in the very thing in which they behaved proudly, he was above them. Now, this is, again, there's a little bit of language that might be confusing because he says, in which they behaved proudly. The gods aren't real. They can't behave proudly. But who did behave proudly? The people did. Specifically, which man? Pharaoh did, who even considered himself a deity, and God triumphed over them in these miraculous demonstrations. So the miracles in Egypt, these plagues, were demonstrations that God was real, that he was august and omnipotent and omniscient and all that, and that their gods were not. All right, one more. I don't think we included this on our list. Go with me to Numbers chapter 33. Let's turn to Numbers chapter 33. Numbers chapter 33. And go back to the beginning. It's a long chapter, to the beginning of the chapter. Verse 1, These are the journeys of the children of Israel who went out of the land of Egypt by their armies under the hand of Moses and Aaron. Now Moses wrote down the starting points of their journeys at the command of the Lord, and these are the journeys, or their journeys, according to their starting points. They departed from Ramesses in the first month, on the 15th day of the first month. On the first day after the Passover, the children of Israel went out with boldness in the sight of the Egyptians. For the Egyptians were burying all their firstborn, whom the Lord had killed among them. Also on their gods, the Lord had executed judgment. So just continual confirmation of the fact that this was a big debate theologically between who is real. That's the whole debate. And the miracles of Egypt were proving that fact. Now, we've read it, Exodus 12, Exodus 15, Exodus 18, Numbers 33, God's plural. That means that Egypt was a polytheistic society. And we don't often throw that term around. But what is polytheism? Belief in many gods, right? It's the belief in many gods, and Egypt was certainly that. And like a lot of cultures, they weren't just polytheistic, they were actually pantheistic, which means that in pantheism, you believe that God is part of the world and we're part of God, and they believe that because a lot of the elements of nature in Egypt were deified, and they ascribed some sort of formal name to a deity that comes from that, but it really was elements of nature that they had elevated to that. So their gods were part of nature, and nature was part of their gods. And that means what we're watching happen unfold in the book of Exodus in these miracles is a debate between two opposing worldviews. And I just jotted down a couple of lessons before we get to the actual deities, just a couple of lessons that we might gain from this. Here's the first one. Is God okay with belief in any deity other than him? All right, this debate in Egypt settles that fact. He's not okay with belief in something other than in himself. Turn real quick to chapter 20 of Exodus. Exodus chapter 20. I know this is not part of the plagues. They've made it out of Egypt. They're out in the desert. They go to Mount Sinai. Moses goes up. He receives the law. Part of that says this, Exodus 20, verse 2. I'm the Lord your God who brought you out of the land of Egypt, out of the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods before me. You shall not make for yourself a carved image, any likeness of anything that's in heaven above, or that's in the earth beneath, or that is in the water under the earth. You shall not bow down to them, nor serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers upon the children to the third and the fourth generations of those who hate me. And then, of course, I think verse 7 kind of goes along with that about taking the name of the Lord in vain. It has a lot of implications. But clearly, God was not interested in sharing glory with false deities. And that is very clear in what he did in the miracles and what he's commanding here. Gene?
Well, even from the language that's recorded here, they give power to the gods of Egypt, even in talking about it. They say, the Lord God is greater than the gods, as if those gods still had power. And they really hadn't learned this lesson, because when you see Moses on the mountain and they start making a bull
It's unbelievable.
that was one of the Egyptian gods,
Yes.
that they haven't learned this lesson, and they don't for 400 years.
Yeah. And that's what makes that so tragic. And as you started talking, that was my first thought too as we were reading through this, because they literally erect images of deities that were utterly proven to be false. And yet they do that. And it's tragic. God is angry. Obviously, as you read the text, there is a natural pause built into the language of God. He just can't even express how angry he is at that situation after what he's proven. And it just kind of, there's this pause at the end of a statement, and Moses interjects and says, but your promise. It's so devastating what they do in spite of that. God is not okay with belief in any deity but him. That is more than proven in what we're studying right now. Before I move to the next point, I want us to look real quick. I can't spend a lot of time here, but go to Isaiah chapter 46. Isaiah chapter 46. If anything, you can go back later this afternoon and read the rest of it. I can't read the whole chapter. We don't have time for that in class this morning, but look at Isaiah 46. The chapter 44, chapter 45, 46, maybe a chapter or two before or after, is really dealing with the tragedy of idolatry. In chapter 46, look at verse 6. He's talking about these idols. He says they lavish gold out of the bag and weigh silver on the scales. They hire a goldsmith and he makes it a god. Now there's such sarcasm built into that statement, because he's saying if you just take a moment to think about a deity that you worship, not me, but an idol god, what's the sarcasm in that? What do they do to the gold? They dig it out of the earth, and then what do they do to the gold they've dug out of the earth? It's this inanimate thing. They turn it into something they worship. That's what they're doing in verse 6. They prostrate themselves, yes, they worship. They pull gold and silver out of the ground, and it's like somewhere between the digging it out of the ground and melting it and pulling the dross off of it and pouring it into a mold and fashioning it. Obviously, they create that, and now somehow they're worshiping that. They've lost the irony in that somewhere. And he says, verse 7, they bear it on the shoulder, they carry it, they set it in its place, and it stands. From its place it shall not move, though one cries out to it, it still can't answer. It's still the inanimate metal that they pulled out of the ground, nor save him out of his trouble. So if there's a hard time, they need sins forgiven, it can't do anything, because in its essence, what is it still? It's still just something they mined out of the earth, and that's all that it'll ever be. Bobby?
It goes back to the created, not worshiping the creator.
That's right.
They are the creator, now worshiping
The created. Yeah, that's right. And of course, Romans 1 talks about the same thing. They worship and serve the created more than the creator. And he does the same thing down, especially when you get down to verse 10. God starts doing what he always does. He'll say, where are their attributes? I can tell the end from the beginning. I know all things in one simultaneous intuition. Those inanimate objects don't do that, and yet they posit to them attributes of deity which they don't have. Tom?
What was going on in Egypt is really going on all over the world.
Oh, it's the same thing still happening today. Yeah.
Societies like India, for instance.
Yeah.
But monotheism, almost I know, the Israelites were
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, God's way of living has always been monotheistic. It's always been one God, and from that have branched out. You can go back to Genesis 4, and you get some of those early indications of more than one belief and more than one deity. So it's always been around, and most of the pagan cultures have always been that way. But listen, we're talking about idols, where you create an image or you have some belief that there's an actual God like our God in heaven. But what is an idol? In its most basic, rudimentary, fundamental definition, what is an idol? It's anything that receives our devotion or adoration. Is it just pieces of gold and silver we put on a mantle? What else could an idol be? Money. It could be money. Stuff. Yeah, I heard lots of stuff. Lots of things. It could be anything that we give our attention to. Recreation, whatever it is, whatever it is, sports or whatever. And all those things are fine in their own context. But none of them are meant to take the place of God. And when we elevate something and put it on the throne and we worship that with our time and our devotion, it becomes an idol. And it's the same problem that they experienced in Egypt. But they were definitely polytheistic. Now, just as an aside, I said you can go back and read this. Read chapter 44 in connection to what we just noted in Isaiah. Because if you start down, especially around verse 9, and read through about verse 20, God is just openly mocking idols. And, he talks about how that they cut down a tree and they'll carve the wood out. And the rest of what the idol came of, they'll make a fire with it and they'll use it. And then the very idol itself can be burned. And he just openly mocks the idol gods like he does over in chapter 46. So the first thing we wrote down is God is not okay with other deities, and that's clear in this debate in Egypt. And the second thing is this, I wrote down, it's because idols are opposed to reality. What they believed in Egypt was not real, and God was demonstrating to them through these miraculous occurrences, through the miracles in Egypt, that He is real, and He defines reality, but idols are not real. And that means, number 3, that God, through the miracles, is trying to change their worldview. What we really see is this massive evangelism taking place in Egypt, because is it true or false that God wants all men to be saved? That's true, right? So even in Egypt, even though you've got a stubborn Pharaoh who God predicted before it all started, he said he's going to harden his heart, which is what we talked about last week, the hardening of Pharaoh's heart. He's going to harden his heart, but he still wanted him to be saved. And the way to do that is to present the evidence that your worldview is not true. And we are still today worldview changers. That's what we are. We're meant to change the worldview of people. In 2 Corinthians 10, beginning of verse 3, when Paul said the weapons of our warfare are not carnal, but they're mighty through God to the pulling down of strongholds, casting down illogical arguments, imaginations, and trying to captivate the hearts of people to the loyalty of Jesus Christ, meaning that our job in this world is to change the way people see the world so that they can come to Christ. That was happening in Egypt. That was a massive evangelism effort taking place in Egypt. Now, just as a note, because we could spend a lot of time on this, just as a note, worldviews have consequences. Ideas have consequences. They always do, right? And when people abandon God, it affects the way they view everything else. Life and reality is affected by that. Already in Exodus, have we seen the effect of the Egyptian worldview on the way they look at life and other people? What were they doing to the Israelites in chapter 1? They were killing babies. When your worldview is corrupted and you don't understand the God of heaven correctly, it affects the way that you view the world. It affects the way you view other people. And then you get to chapter 5, we read it last week, where the cruelty was just crazy. And we even saw the passage in Ezekiel where he compared it to the iron rod of Egypt, So they're guilty of violence and cruelty. And I say it because sometimes the way we approach this is not the greatest way. If you want to stop violence in the world and you want to keep murder out of the world, how do you do it? You change people's understanding of what or who? You change their understanding of God. That's how you change your worldview. And that's what God was doing in Egypt. All right, number 2. Consider the following list of Egyptian deities. Now, what we did, we just kind of put a grid out on the paper, the notes, and you can take whatever notes you want to take on this. And we could print something if that's more helpful, but I just thought, sometimes you memorize things a little better if you write it down, and plus you could do some studying on that. So I'm going to kind of follow the course of the plagues. I want to kind of follow the plagues and talk about some of the Egyptian deities that were in play during the specific plagues. Now, you could probably lump them all in because they're kind of all connected together, but let's take miracle number 1. What was the very first plague? Or water turned to blood. That's what we're covering next week. So water to blood, that's in chapter 7, verses 14 through 25. Were you able to find any Egyptian deities, or do you know of any that would probably have been connected to what God was demonstrating here? Yeah. And that's the one I'm thinking of. The first one, probably the main one here, is the god of Hapi. And this is the god of the Nile River, right? And when they turn the water to blood, you're basically taught, well, it says all the water in the land of Egypt is affected by this, but everything was usually a tributary off of the Nile River. So Hapi was the god of the Nile, and by the way, he was a bull god. He looked like a bull. He was often shown holding vases for libations. That's how he was known. Also, you could probably we'll talk about Isis in a minute, not the terrorist group, but the god of Egypt. But there was a god called Isis, and Khnum also probably fits this. But I think Hapi is the god that's probably primarily under consideration because they worshipped Hapi as the god of the Nile. And by completely annihilating their water system, he was showing that Hapi has no power, is not real, and that he is. So Hapi is probably the singular god that was under consideration here. All right, then you move to plague number 2. Remember what plague number 2 was? Frogs. They were everywhere, just all over the place. It's not like 1 or 2 croaking outside and you can shut the windows and kind of drown them out. That's not what was happening. They were everywhere, all over, interior, exterior, everywhere. Chapter 8, verses 1 through 15. There was an Egyptian deity named Heket, and Heket was the goddess of birth, and she was, interestingly, a frog-headed goddess. And when God demonstrates his power in Egypt in the plague of the frogs, he is showing that he is the one who controls nature and not their gods like Heket or Hapi. So you probably have the goddess Heket, who was a frog-headed goddess who was the goddess of birth under number 2, or plague number 2. Then you have plague number 3, which is the plague of lice. The plague of lice in chapter 8, verses 16 through 19. We'll try to be a little bit more detailed about that when we get to it. There isn't much written about that, right? We have just a small section, but visually it's not a very appealing thing that happens in Egypt at all, especially given some of the cultural habits. But there's the god of Set, S-E-T, S-E-T. And I should probably spell these. I don't even know if I put those on the list. There's the god of Hapi, the god of Heket, H-E-Q-E-T, and then the god of Set, S-E-T, who was the god of deserts and storms. Now remember what Moses did for the lice. He grabbed a handful of what? Dust, dirt, right? And God said all the dust of the earth should be lice. And that don't mean one handful. You think about every single grain of every piece of sand you're standing on turning to lice, and you get a sense of what that plague must have been like. But Set, S-E-T, was the god of sorrow, or the god of deserts and storms. And likely when God did this, he was demonstrating his power over Set. You could probably add to this Ra, who was the sun god. He was the maker god, the god of all gods. Ra was, or Amun-Ra as he's known. And then Ukchak, which is U-A-T, or U-A-T-C-H-I-T, is also perhaps a god that may have sort of had some connection to plague number 3. Plague number 4, though, I definitely think these gods were involved in it, because plague number 4 was the plague of flies. And we'll talk about some of the connection between the frogs and the lice and the flies when we get to it. But the flies, they dominated Egypt at that time. And Uatchit, that particular god, is represented by the fly. So you can see the connection between the gods and some of the imagery of the gods and the very plagues that God rendered in Egypt at that time. All right, then there's plague number 5, which is the death of livestock. King James would say the murrain of cattle, but it's a disease of cattle in chapter 9, verses 1 through 7. And as we go through, just as an aside, thinking out loud, there's a couple of these where so some critics of the Bible accuse contradictions inside this. They'll say, you can't have this plague because he's already said he's done this. We'll talk about how to answer some of those things as we go through the plagues. Chapter 9, verses 1 through 7. In this plague, probably in play here is the god Hathor, Hathor, who is the goddess of with a cow head. So you have at least 2 with a cow head. There's Hathor, she's the goddess with a cow head, and Hapi, the god of the Nile, has like a bull's head, which when they built, Gene was talking about, they build the golden calves. It was probably based on models they had seen in Egypt of these 2. So Hathor was the goddess with a cow head, and Apis, A-P-I-S, was a bull god, considered the sacred bull of Memphis and called the creator god along with Ra. So there's Apis. But this probably was involved in the death of the livestock. Then the boils, plague number 6. And by the way, if you're trying to outline this, most Bibles, if you go look at chapter 9 real quick of Exodus. Look at chapter 9. Not every Bible is good to describe what follows underneath. The headings are not inspired, right, in the Bibles. But in chapter 9, for example, when you start in verse 8, it'll say the 6th plague, boils. These are all apt descriptions. It's a good way of, if you're just looking down at the page, you can kind of see the segments where you see the plagues set apart. In chapter 9, verses 8 through 12, you see the plague of boils. Then you can see between verse 12 and verse 13, the plague of hail. So you see that, and that's a good way of just sort of visually knowing where they start and stop. So the plague of boils. There was a goddess known as Sekhenet, Sekhenet, who was the goddess with power over diseases. Now, a lot of the Egyptian deities were assigned to the fields of science and medicine. Those are definitely at play here. There was an actual man by the name of Imhotep, not from the movie The Mummy, but this is the actual man in history known as Imhotep. He was the chief ritualist of Egypt. He was supposed to be a magician of sorts. He may have in some sense, some of what he had come up with may have been in play when they're throwing the staff down, it becomes a snake, and you've got the limited amount of water turning into blood and things of that sort, the leprous hand, all that could be some things when they try to mimic what's going on. But he was considered, after he died, they deified him and called him the god of medicine. So Imhotep was worshipped by the people. And then Sunu, S-U-N-U, was the pestilence god. So when God afflicts them, for example, like in verse 9 of chapter 9, where you've got boils that break out and sores on man and beast throughout all the land of Egypt, he's clearly demonstrating that their deities had zero control over the human body as they attested to have. So you've got these 3 gods or goddesses that were likely in play here. Then you probably have 2 or 3 gods, these deities that are involved in plagues number 7 and 8. Because plague 7 and plague 8, the hail and the locust, they kind of focus on the same thing. When the hail comes through, very little is left of their crops. There's just very little left of anything. And then what's left, the locusts just demolish. And you see that, the plague of hail, verse 13, down through the end of the chapter. And then the plague of locust, if you're looking at chapter 10, right above that you see chapter 10, verse 1, the 8th plague, locusts. All right. And then the locusts come through and they, again, destroy everything. And that's we mentioned last week, Pharaoh hardened his heart. There was a turning point for a lot of the people in Egypt. This is the turning point for a lot of folks in Egypt. There are a lot of, obviously, advisors who are standing next to him after the hail and the locusts come through, and they say, you have to stop this madness. You have got to give in to these demands, or there won't be anything left of Egypt. They're begging him to do something at this point. And that's where you see, according to last week's lesson, this is where you see Pharaoh just kind of dig his heels in. He says, no, we're not letting them go. And then you go from that to darkness and then the death of the firstborn. But you probably have two gods here involved in plagues number 7 and 8. Nut, N-U-T, is the sky goddess, and then Osiris is the god of their crops. Now, a lot of these deities had multiple applications, but Osiris was also god of crops. And so when you see the crops destroyed and the sky darkened by locust, it just completely removes any hope of the Egyptians in believing that these things are real. But those two probably in play. Then in number 9, you've got the plague of darkness. That's in chapter 10, verses 21 to 29. And this is not normal darkness. This is like, it's not 3 days of nighttime. It's, they don't move. They're so scared to move because it's so dark they can't see where they would be going. Like beyond cave dark, right? When you turn the lights out in a cave, it's beyond dark. My mind races when we do this. It's certainly not verified. If you've read Josephus, you know that Josephus, there was a long-standing tradition among some of the Jews, and it could have just been lore. We have no way to verify this. But during the darkness, Josephus even records that God sent demons to terrorize the people during the darkness, and that's why they were so petrified to move. They were just scared out of their mind. I don't know whether that's true or not. But the plague of darkness. So you have Ra, who's the sun god, Amun-Ra, the sun god, and then again Hathor, who was the sky goddess, that cow-headed goddess, who was the goddess of beauty and joy. But both of these were supposed to be in control of the sky, and yet to have this petrifying, completely immobilizing darkness is God demonstrating your deities are not real. They have no power. I'm in charge. That's what he was doing. And then maybe Shu, S-H-U, was the god of the atmosphere. Shu was the god of the atmosphere. And so all three of those probably in play during the darkness. And remember, God said, I'm executing judgment on the gods of Egypt. So these are all probably involved here. And then you have probably 2 specific deities under consideration in the death of the firstborn. The death of the firstborn. And by the way, it wasn't just people. What did it also include? Animals too, right? All firstborn across the board. The god of men, M-I-N, was the god of reproduction. So it involved children, any kind of child involved. And then Isis, going back to Isis, was supposed to be the god who protected the children. And by the way, Pharaoh considered himself a deity. What would his son be considered? A deity, because he's from Pharaoh. And the death of Pharaoh's own firstborn son would be God taking out one of their deities, not just demonstrating power against one, but taking out what they believed to be a deity. And of course, that was Pharaoh's choice because God gave him a way around that. But all of these gods or goddesses were involved in the Egyptian polytheistic system, and in some way or another, every single one of these plagues, all of these plagues, were strikes against those gods and goddesses in Egypt to prove they are powerless. They are not real, as a way of affecting them to change their worldview, to get away from a worldview that opposed the worldview of God. And then, just to end that, go back to chapter 6. Look at verse 1. Remember the debate. In fact, let's go back and rehash this, just to rehearse it, just for real quick. Chapter 5, verse 1. Chapter 5, verse 1. What indicated the exertion of the Lord's authority here? What's the statement? Thus says the Lord. God said, I'm in charge, you will let my people go. And then look over to verse 10. What did Pharaoh say? Thus says Pharaoh, I don't respect your authority. I am my own God, and I worship the gods of Egypt. And then so in chapter 6 and verse 1, the Lord says to Moses, now you will see You're gonna see demonstrations. You will see what I will do to Pharaoh, for with a strong hand he will let them go, and with a strong hand he will drive them out of his land. Now pair that with all the verses at the beginning. I'm going to execute judgment on the gods of Egypt. And what God was going to do is decimate Egyptian polytheism. And he did it in those 10 plagues in Egypt. All right. That's a lot, I know. And it's hard when you're not used to a mythology, right? Because you believe in one God. It's hard to talk about multiple gods and how they looked and what they must have done or what they must have been in charge of. But all of those deities were likely in play, and probably others too, but those were the main deities that were specifically connected to the very elements that God attacked in Egypt to prove his superiority over all of them. Any thoughts on any of this? Joel, and I know you probably had something to say, but just...
I didn't realize there was a number of gods in Egypt, and some of them were a specified city.
Yes, they were.
Major gods, male, major deities, female,
Yeah,
major deities, either woman, and then you had the minor deities.
yeah.
I did not realize that.
Yeah. Now, I didn't use the source information that you had told me about, but Joel said if you go to, I think you said Apologetics Press. So Apologetics Press has some pretty good information on the deities that were worshipped in Egypt, and they might go into a little greater detail on some of the things that we went into here, but there's some good information on that. I would think this would probably be, because kids are so familiar with the story of the 10 plagues, and it's one of those stories that resonates with kids. It's not just a kid's story, but it does resonate with kids. That if we want to teach our children a really good, strong worldview, that there's just one God, this would be a great story to do that, because that's what God is proving in the miracles of Egypt. So go through and talk about the miracles and use some of those verses, and we could say, now what was God trying to prove? And the kids can figure it out. God was proving that there's only one God. And if we can do that, that might help them later in life when they are struggling against their own idols, right? Because everybody struggles to have those things in their life, that if we can just remember the story of the 10 plagues in Egypt, we might be able to kind of put those things aside and not be involved in our own form of idolatry, because we sure don't want to do that. All right, next week, first plague, water to blood. What do you know about it? What do you think you know about it? And we're going to talk about it. The critics of the Bible tell us it wasn't even really blood. There's a bunch of red algae under the bottom of the Nile, and if you stir it up the right way, it kind of turns the water red, and that's really what's going on. So they always have some sort of naturalistic explanation. We don't believe that. God really turned it into actual blood. We're going to talk about the implications of that next week. Grab a copy of those notes, and we'll talk about it. Thank you so much for your input today. I know it was a hard lesson, but thank you for hanging in there. Appreciate it.